The morning of January 12, 1945, arrived not with daylight but with fire. Across nearly 700 kilometers, the horizon detonated in an unbroken sequence of thunderous blasts. It was the opening of the Vistula offensive. The earth shook beneath German boots as more than 7,000 Soviet artillery guns unleashed their fire at once. The frozen fog magnified the noise, making the front seem to dissolve even before the first infantry units advanced. This was not a battle, it was a surgical severing. The Wehrmacht, depleted, fragmented, and devoid of reserves, was scarcely capable of responding. The collapse of the Eastern Front was not a controlled withdrawal but a psychological unraveling. Some soldiers simply deserted their positions, moving westward without orders or purpose, driven solely by the instinct to flee the Red Army. In countless units, officers stood powerless as men dropped rifles into the snow and walked away without turning back. Others remained rooted in place, clawing frantically at the frozen ground with bare hands, attempting to deepen useless trenches before enemy fire reached them. War diaries recorded sudden paralysis, loss of mobility, and total breakdown of command structures. An irreversible process had begun. The German leadership understood it. Heinz Guderian, chief of the General Staff, had warned Hitler that the front resembled a house of cards. Divisions no longer functioned as coherent formations. West of Warsaw, the 342nd Infantry Division counted barely 600 effective soldiers and only 3 functioning artillery pieces. Fuel was measured in liters rather than barrels. Vehicles were abandoned along roadsides, empty of fuel long before encountering the enemy. Guderian told his staff, "We are not defending a line. We are defending a memory." Soldier morale had collapsed silently but completely. They no longer fought for the Führer or the Reich, they fought simply to avoid being captured alive. Memories of German atrocities in the East, burned villages, mass shootings, deliberate starvation inflicted on millions, returned like a shadow across the front. Soviet troops required no propaganda to fuel their rage. Many carried photographs of murdered relatives, destroyed homes, and cities reduced to rubble by the Wehrmacht. They advanced with a single word burned into their consciousness: revenge. Early German reports described scenes of apocalypse, echoing the most violent biblical visions. Roads leading toward Berlin filled with civilians fleeing on foot, carts, and bicycles, pushing crude wagons loaded with children, animals, and whatever possessions could be salvaged. Some dragged frozen corpses behind them, hoping to bury them on territory still under German control. Others collapsed along the roadsides, exhausted and devoid of will. A German officer wrote in his diary, "The rear is more terrifying than the front. We are not retreating with an army, we are retreating with a people in collapse." The Wehrmacht no longer possessed reliable communications. Trust disintegrated by the hour. Orders arrived too late or not at all. Radios were silenced by overwhelming interference. Headquarters relocated every day, sometimes more often. Maps became meaningless. Villages designated as defensive positions had already fallen to Soviet forces before German units received instructions. The German army did not withdraw step by step, it shattered into fragments. Soviet marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konyev advanced with calculated precision. The offensive had been prepared for weeks with unprecedented logistical depth. The Red Army committed more than 2.5 million men, 6,000 tanks, 46,000 artillery pieces, and thousands of aircraft. While German units struggled to distribute black bread and dwindling ammunition, Soviet trains delivered endless supplies of fuel, shells, and full combat rations. The imbalance itself was a verdict. In German trenches, some soldiers wrote final letters to God rather than to their families. Others burned photographs so they would not fall into enemy hands. Military chaplains reported growing numbers of soldiers refusing confession or communion, insisting forgiveness was no longer attainable. Defeat was no longer a military probability but a spiritual certainty. Amid the chaos, Hitler continued issuing commands from his bunker, demanding counterattacks by divisions that existed only on paper. His speeches no longer inspired obedience but disbelief. In several sectors, commanders acted autonomously, ignoring Berlin altogether. The war ceased to be strategy. At best, it became a panicked retreat into the jaws of the wolf. German highways turned into battlefields, entire divisions marching westward under relentless pursuit by Soviet armor. In many places, German troops did not resist, they simply stepped aside. In the air, the Luftwaffe was nearly absent. Soviet aircraft dominated the skies, striking without opposition. German pilots understood that every sortie might be their final one. The national horizon narrowed, victory vanished from thought, replaced by a single question: how long until Soviet tanks rolled into Berlin? The belief in the capital's invulnerability collapsed. Reports spoke of enemy columns advancing 30 kilometers per day. For countless soldiers, the war ceased to be a duty and became an hourglass, its sand draining in one direction only. A phrase circulated among German troops in eastern forests, shattered villages, and overcrowded refugee trains: this is no longer a war. It is the end of the world. The opening of the Soviet assault, known as the Oder-Neisse offensive, arrived at dawn on April 16, 1945. With a tense, almost ceremonial silence. Along the Oder River, where the German army had established what it believed to be its final defensive barrier, soldiers waited motionless, numb fingers gripping rifles, eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. At 3:30 a.m., the stillness was annihilated. The horizon burst into continuous light as more than 40,000 Soviet artillery guns fired simultaneously, bathing the sky in red flashes like frozen lightning stretched across the land. It was the largest concentrated bombardment in European military history. The Oder offensive had begun. For 40 minutes, Soviet fire hammered German positions without pause. Wehrmacht troops crouched in improvised trenches between the Oder marshes and the Silo heights shook, not from fear, but because the ground itself seemed alive. Many were deafened within minutes. The earth heaved like a colossal chest breathing fire. Telephone lines were cut instantly. Observation posts vanished. Entire German divisions ceased to exist before the first Soviet tank advanced. The assault had been planned with obsessive precision by Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konyev. Stalin, while denying them a shared triumph, deliberately set them in rivalry, ordering both to race toward the heart of the Reich. Zhukov, commanding the First Belarusian Front, was to breach the Oder defenses and attack Berlin from the east. Konyev, leading the First Ukrainian Front, was to advance from the south and ensure he did not fall behind. The city, long a symbol of European power, was to become the ultimate prize. At 4 a.m., Zhukov ordered the second phase. Thousands of searchlights switched on at once, projecting beams across the battlefield to blind defenders and illuminate advancing infantry. Dense fog mixed with smoke and dust scattered the light chaotically. From above, the front resembled a glowing sea of mist in which human figures moved like writhing shadows. The war had entered its final stage and no longer followed the logic of conventional combat. It had become a struggle of near-mythic scale. Hitler had entrusted the defense of the Oder to Colonel General Gotthard Heinrichsei, perhaps the last German commander capable of temporarily slowing the Soviet advance. Heinrichsei, austere, deeply religious, and intensely methodical, had ordered frontline units to withdraw just before the bombardment, anticipating the Soviet tactic of obliterating the forward defenses before assault. This decision spared thousands of German soldiers from immediate annihilation. It was an act of tactical brilliance and a tacit admission of defeat. The attack could not be stopped, only postponed. When Soviet infantry crossed the Oder, they encountered smoking craters where trenches had been. German machine guns positioned on secondary lines opened fire with lethal accuracy. The Silo Heights, the final natural barrier before Berlin, became a killing ground. Soviet divisions advanced, were decimated, and were instantly replaced by fresh waves. Zhukov, under pressure from Stalin, ordered T-34 tanks forward even without infantry support. Many sank into the marshes, burning as crews attempted escape amid screams. By midday, the German defensive line no longer existed as a line. It had become a patchwork of isolated resistance, small groups fighting from cellars, trenches, or the ruins of farms. SS units shot any German attempting to retreat. Roads were choked with civilian columns fleeing as Soviet armor thundered past. The noise of battle never subsided, it was a continuous vibration, as if the air itself were aflame. In the Reich Chancellery bunker, Hitler received news of the offensive's start. He insisted Berlin could hold for weeks. He proclaimed that the Red Army would be destroyed before the capital as Hannibal had been before Rome. No one answered. Beyond the armored walls, reality collapsed with each explosion. Guderian attempted to report that Zhukov had committed over 2 million men to the attack. Hitler responded by slamming the table, demanding counterattacks by panzer divisions that no longer existed. In forests near the Neisse River, remnants of German units reorganized while retreating. Soldiers carried rusted weapons, some armed with captured Italian rifles, others with barely enough ammunition for a single day. Company commanders argued whether to hold positions or retreat without authorization. The war had become pure survival, stripped of illusion, authority, and hope. On the night of April 16, messengers reported that the Soviets had penetrated more than 10 kilometers. The CEO heights, Berlin's shield, were on the verge of collapse. German positions were lit by uncontrolled fires. The ground was covered with bodies, blood, and mud-stained uniforms. Broken gas masks and helmets perforated by shrapnel. In the air floated the smell of burning flesh mixed with gunpowder and spilled fuel. A German officer described the scene with a phrase that would be repeated in all chronicles of that day. The odor is no longer a defensive line. It is the gate of hell, and it has opened to let them through. The role of the commanders. Zhukov versus Konv. In the early hours of April 1, 1945, while Berlin still clung to the illusion of resistance, two men studied the map of the Reich with silent ambition. Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konv, the two most famous marshals of the Red Army, were not just commanding armies, they were competing for history. Both knew that Stalin would grant the glory of Berlin's fall to only one of them. And every kilometer advanced, every bridge secured, every enemy division annihilated could mean the difference between immortality and oblivion. Stalin, sitting in his Kremlin office, did not hide his intention to pit them against each other. The Soviet leader had understood that rivalry was a weapon more powerful than any tank. Instead of clearly assigning attack sectors, he drew ambiguous lines on the map. He ordered Zhukov to advance directly from the Oder front to Berlin, while KV was to penetrate from the south. He did not establish clear boundaries between their operational zones. The one who arrives first, Stalin said without changing his tone, will be the one to raise the red flag over the capital of fascism. Neither marshal replied. It was unnecessary. The final war was no longer just against Germany. It was between them. Georgy Zhukov, hero of Moscow, and Stalingrad, was known for his brutal determination. His methods were direct, almost ruthless. He calculated losses based on expected progress. He had once said, "The more intense the fire, the faster the enemy will be reduced." He did not believe in complex maneuvers. His strategy to take Berlin was as simple as it was terrifying. Crush any resistance with successive waves until the German capacity to respond was completely erased. Even Konyev, more thoughtful and less impulsive, had demonstrated superior tactical flexibility in previous operations. His style combined precision attacks with rapid envelopments. He had gained a reputation for better preserving the lives of his men and for his ability to improvise on the ground. But he was also aware that Zhukov outshone him in prestige. Stalin had relegated him more than once to secondary objectives. This time he was not willing to fall behind. On April 2, Stalin summoned both marshals via encrypted radio. He informed them that the general offensive would begin on April 16. He did not mention exclusive advanced corridors. Zhukov understood the message in his own way. He had to arrive first, no matter the cost. KV understood he had a license to disregard any tactical boundary if he saw a clear path to Berlin. The enemy was no longer just Hitler. It was the other Soviet marshal. On April 16, Zhukov launched his offensive on the CEO heights with unprecedented violence. He ordered the simultaneous use of searchlights and heavy artillery. Convinced that he would break the German line within hours, but Heinrich's resistance and the swampy terrain frustrated his plan. Soviet losses were catastrophic. Tanks sank into the mud. Infantry fell before reaching the defenses. As the day progressed and the German line remained standing, Zhukov began to lose control. He shouted orders over the radio, demanding new bombardments without pause. Every passing minute was humiliation compared to KV, who was operating in the south with smoother progress. Stalin received the first reports at noon. He did not directly criticize Zhukov. He simply told Ken, "You have authorization to move directly to Berlin. Use whatever route you deem convenient." It was the opening shot of the race. KV looked at the map and saw his opportunity. They could take Berlin from the southwest, crossing the Spree River. He ordered his armored armies to advance without stopping to consolidate positions. "Whoever looks back will not reach the capital," he said coldly to his commanders. Meanwhile, Zhukov intensified his offensive. He ordered tanks to advance even under direct enemy fire. Casualties exceeded all prior calculations, but the marshal did not stop the attack. Stalin, observing the communications, smiled slightly. He had achieved what he wanted. Two giants of the Red Army destroying the last German defenses while competing with each other. On April 19, the CEO line finally broke. Zhukov sent a message to Moscow. "The enemy is retreating. I am 70 kilometers from Berlin." Minutes later, he received an intelligence report. KV's troops had breached the German defenses from the south and were advancing quickly along the highway toward Berlin. Zhukov's fury was immediate. He ordered tank units to be redirected to cut off that route before Konf could get ahead. The roads filled with Soviet columns competing for space in a kind of internal conflict that strained the advance with the possibility of an unnecessary collapse. Some reports even claimed there were isolated shootings between reconnaissance units who later claimed to have mistaken their rivals for German forces. Nevertheless, many believed the shootings were intentional. For Zhukov and KV, the rivalry had become a second front of the war. On April 20th, Adolf Hitler's birthday, the first Soviet shells began falling on central Berlin. Zhukov and Kahn sent simultaneous reports to Stalin, each claiming to be the first to bomb the capital. Stalin did not respond. He watched. He waited. He knew the true glory was not in bombing Berlin, but in taking the Reich, the supreme symbol of the enemy, and only one of his marshals would achieve it. In the bunker of the Chancellery, while the corridors vibrated from the bombings, Hitler asked to see the map of Soviet lines. He saw two colossal forces approaching his capital from different directions. "They are not attacking Berlin," he said in a broken voice. "They are competing to destroy it." And the Führer was not wrong. The desperate resistance of General Henrici. On March 20, 1945, in a sparse office far from the illusions of the Berlin bunker, Colonel General Goddard Henrici received the final order to take command of the Vistula Army Group and stop the Red Army in its advance toward the capital. It was an impossible military mission. Henrici knew it. His forces were shattered, his supply lines broken, troop morale on the verge of collapse. But he accepted, not out of loyalty to Adolf Hitler or the Reich, but out of an almost religious sense of duty to delay the collapse to prevent an even greater catastrophe for the civilian population. Henrici was a strange man for the Nazi era. Austere, deeply pious, abstinent, an enemy of ostentation, he lacked the ideological fanaticism of his colleagues. He saw the war as a biblical calamity, not a racial crusade. He knew the Red Army would not stop at taking cities or defeating divisions. It came to settle scores. When he reached the Oder River line, he walked silently among the remnants of shattered units, observing flooded trenches, artillery positions buried in craters, and the frozen bodies of soldiers without coffins. The final battle was about to begin, and he had to organize an army that no longer existed. His first act was tactical and bold. He ordered the troops to withdraw from the forward lines to avoid the direct impact of the initial Soviet bombardment. Unlike Hitler, who demanded holding every meter as if sacred, Henrici understood that true defense meant preserving men, not positions. His subordinates, surprised, warned him that this retreat violated specific Führer orders. Henrici calmly replied, "A destroyed trench cannot defend itself. A living soldier can fight again." When the Red Army launched the first bombardment of the Oder-Neser offensive, the German front lines were empty. Explosions fell on deserted trenches, burned useless barbed wire, and pulverized improvised fortifications. Zhukov interpreted the absence of German fire as a sign of immediate victory, but when his infantry advanced confidently, German machine guns opened fire from hidden positions kilometers back. For a few hours, Henrici achieved the impossible, deceiving the largest concentration of military forces in European history. However, the scale of the Soviet attack surpassed any human attempt at resistance. The First Belarusian Front and the First Ukrainian Front advanced like two giant titans converging on Berlin. Henrici walked the positions on foot, wearing a gray coat and a face marked by exhaustion. He stopped at each trench and asked soldiers if they had water, needed blankets, or could keep resisting. His men respected him, not for his speeches, but for his gaze. They knew he too awaited death. It was impossible not to think that the end of ends was approaching at tank cruise speed. Reports from the front were increasingly desperate. Entire units shrank to groups of 20 or 30 men. Ammunition was counted by individual cartridges. In some sectors, soldiers only fired when they saw the target within 100 meters. Orders arriving from Berlin were delirious. Non-existent counterattacks, ghost divisions that were supposed to appear from the map. Henrici, without raising his voice, began ignoring them. His war was no longer Hitler's war. It was a war against time. On April 18, in a command meeting, Henrici announced that there would be no retreat to Berlin. Every meter ceded had to cost Soviet blood, not because he believed in victory, but because every day gained meant that tens of thousands of civilians could escape westward, where they hoped to surrender to the Americans. "We fight to save what remains of Germany, not the regime," he said without writing it down. That phrase was never spoken publicly, but it was understood by everyone present. On the night of the second day of the offensive, Henrici observed the hills of Silo engulfed in flames. The ground burned with orange streaks. Soviet artillery did not cease for a moment. Medical teams had ceased to exist. There was no one left to lift the fallen, care for the sick, or even bury the dead. The roads were covered with destroyed vehicles, dead horses, civilians trapped among rubble. The air smelled of ammonia, gunpowder, and burnt flesh. "This is not the end of a battle," he murmured. "It is the end of a world." Despite his strict discipline, Henrici began to come into direct conflict with Hitler. He refused to execute orders he considered suicidal for his men. He refused to participate in decisions that involved sacrificing entire cities in vain, knowing that every man or child he sent to face the Soviet onslaught would be one less German to reclaim the homeland after the fall of Nazism. Hitler, furious, accused him of cowardice and called him a traitor, an accusation to which Henrici did not respond. He knew his fate was sealed and defeat inevitable. But as long as he had men under his command, he would continue fighting, not to save the Führer, but to prevent the Red Army from arriving before the German people could flee. On April 20, after 4 days of continuous combat, the line broke. The 9th Parachute Division had been annihilated. The positions at CEO were silent. Soviet troops were already crossing the last natural obstacle before Berlin. Henrici received a final report. "The remaining forces cannot continue the defense. Order a retreat or we will be encircled." Henrici stood up, took his cap, and left the command tent. he observed the horizon. No sun, no sky, only columns of smoke rising into the void. He did not speak a word. Germany's last major defense had vanished. The road to Berlin was open. The foreign fighters of the Reich, they were the last to keep believing. While the German people fled westward, while high-ranking officers sought to negotiate their surrender or escape by plane, they marched toward Berlin to die. They were not native Germans, but had come from Norway, Denmark, Belgium, France, the Netherlands, Croatia, Latvia, even Great Britain. They had abandoned their native flags to serve the Waffen-SS with a personal oath to fight to the end for Adolf Hitler. Even as the Germans themselves began to abandon that name as if it burned their lips, many wore a patch on their uniform with a Nordic cross, a Flemish lion or Viking runes. Others displayed insignias with Himmler's black sun or the Totenkopf skull. For them, the fall of the Reich was not just the defeat of a nation, but the collapse of a worldview. They believed that Berlin was not simply a capital, but the ideological Rome of a racial empire that never came to exist. And they knew that if they were captured, they would have no right to honorable surrender. They would be shot as traitors by the Western Allies or executed without trial by the Soviets. The most feared of these forces was the 33rd SS Division Charlemagne, made up of French volunteers. They arrived in Berlin in mid-April when German units were already collapsing. One of their officers, Henri Fenet, declared to his men, "France is dead. Only here in Berlin can we build its rebirth," words spoken before a group of soldiers who had no homeland to return 2. They fought among the ruins of No, firing Panzerrests from windows of burning buildings. In just 2 days, they destroyed 11 Soviet tanks. When they ran out of ammunition, they continued fighting with hand grenades and knives. None surrendered. North of the Reichstag, the 11th SS Division Nordland, composed of Norwegians and Danes, defended the Vedandama bridge alongside remnants of German units. Their commander, Fritz von Schultz, had fallen months earlier, but his spirit lived on in those men who believed they were fighting to preserve the purity of Europe. Many war medals earned on the Leningrad front. Now they fought desperately because they knew what would come if the Red Army took the city. Revenge without limits. "We are not defending the Germans," said a Danish volunteer. "We are defending ourselves from the spiritual annihilation of the continent." Along the Spree River, Latvians of the 15th and 19th SS Division also fought, having sworn not to fall alive into Soviet hands. They had seen their villages destroyed, their families deported to Siberia. For them, fighting in Berlin was the last act of rebellion against Russian rule. Some carried improvised bombs tied to their bodies with the aim of throwing themselves at enemy tanks when they ran out of bullets. In the government district, a British unit of the St. George Legion, created by John Amory, son of a minister in Churchill's cabinet, resisted alongside the remnants of the Hitler Youth. Amory had been captured and sentenced to death for treason, but a small group of followers remained in Berlin. They were few, perhaps 50 in total, but they were determined to die in combat rather than face the gallows in their homeland. As the Soviet encirclement tightened, these foreign forces became the most fanatical and effective fighters on the German side. They did not desert. They did not negotiate. They did not retreat. Every building became a fortress. Every basement was a trench. While Wehrmacht units tried to surrender with improvised white flags, the foreign SS continued firing even at German soldiers trying to flee. When Zhukov's troops took the Reichstag, it was the French of Charlemagne who launched the final counterattack. They advanced among collapsed columns and smoke curtains, shooting at any movement. Some died, burned by flamethrowers, others under roofs destroyed by artillery collapse. A French soldier wrote on a piece of cardboard before dying, "We do not fight for Hitler. We fight for the idea we carry inside." In the final hours of April 30th, while Hitler committed suicide in his bunker outside, the foreign fighters still held their positions among the rubble. The Danes had been surrounded near the Tear Garden. The French resisted in the basement of the Ministry of Air. The Latvians continued attacking tanks with smoke grenades and improvised rocket launchers. Unlike the German units which received the order to cease fire, many foreigners did not acknowledge it. Their war did not end with a gunshot in the Führer bunker. It ended when the last of them fell under enemy fire without surrendering their weapon. The next day, the Soviets found the bodies of men speaking different languages with different flags sewn under the black SS uniform. None carried documents indicating a return. None had asked for mercy. None survived the logistic and moral chaos in the Wehrmacht. The German army was no longer an army. It was a mass of scattered men without fuel or ammunition moving among the rubble of a collapsing country. The divisions Hitler still mentioned on his maps simply did not exist. From the 25th Panzer Division, only 11 tanks remained. An infantry division was supposed to have 15,000 men. Some barely reached 600. The roads to Berlin were clogged not with organized columns, but with remnants of units mixed with civilians. Children, carts, soldiers without boots, officers on bicycles, and abandoned trucks due to lack of fuel. The Reich's logistics had imploded, devastating all supply lines. Food depots were empty, trains did not arrive, drivers deserted. Many soldiers had gone 3 days without eating. Black bread was distributed in slices the size of a matchbox. Standard combat rations had ceased to exist. Some fighters boiled leather belts to make a gelatinous soup. Others dismantled corpses of dead horses to obtain frozen raw meat. The Germans had already experienced the state of plunder at the Battle of Stalingrad. Although most Berliners had only heard about it in rumors from the Eastern Front, this new reality was a brutal shock for a society that not long ago had swam in an imperial economy promising to conquer much of Europe without difficulty, but so soon after everything had changed and victory seemed increasingly distant. Not only was food scarce, the enemy was approaching the gates and ammunition was counted by shots. Officers ordered their men to fire only when the enemy was close enough to see with the naked eye. In certain sectors, 3 soldiers shared a rifle. The Panzerasts, the last resort anti-tank weapons, were even used by forcibly recruited civilians. Artillery shells were stored in empty boxes to simulate non-existent reserves. Units receiving orders to counterattack responded with silence. Moral chaos exceeded military chaos. Discipline had disintegrated in the forests east of the Shri River. Groups of soldiers abandoned their positions in the middle of the night, leaving behind sleeping officers. Others removed their uniforms to blend with refugees. Those captured by the Felgen Armory. The German military police were executed immediately. The streets filled with bodies with signs hanging around their necks. Deserter, coward, traitor to the Führer. In many cases, the executives were also vulnerable. Boys, teenagers armed with rifles from the previous century. Within the Wehrmacht, the beginnings of silent mutinies appeared. Officers still trying to organize the defense of the CEO Heights argued openly among themselves. Some demanded retreating to Berlin to form a last defensive perimeter. Others wanted to flee to the Ella to surrender to the Americans. No one believed in victory anymore. The war had become a race to avoid falling alive into the hands of the Red Army. "I prefer 20 years in a French camp to 20 minutes with the Russians," wrote a corporal in his diary before escaping west. The High Command continued issuing unrealistic orders. Hitler ordered large-scale counterattacks with panzer divisions that existed only on paper. Kittel and Jodl transmitted messages beginning with "the Führer expects," as if Hitler's will could produce tanks from nothing. In command rooms, officers burned maps to leave no evidence of retreat. Darien argued violently with Hitler, demanding permission to evacuate Berlin. He was replaced. Any officer hinting that the War was lost, was sidelined or threatened with a firing squad. At the front, the reality was different. The front line. Troops watched their flanks vanish. Artillery batteries fell silent as they ran out of shells. Radio transmitters emitted only interference or cries for help that could not be answered. Entire units surrendered without firing a shot. Others continued fighting out of inertia, not hope, because they did not know what else to do. "We keep firing because we are surrounded and cannot flee," wrote a lieutenant on the outskirts of Fenwalde. The moral devastation even reached high-ranking officers. Some began to disappear mysteriously after command meetings, leaving their uniforms folded with a pistol on top. Others committed suicide in their vehicles upon seeing the first Soviet tanks. Death had become a private choice. The oath to the Führer no longer held weight. Only the instinct of self-preservation or resignation to the inevitable remained. In many units, soldiers stopped responding to the Nazi salute. A Heil Hitler was replaced by a short phrase muttered between teeth. Survive. It was a farewell, a wish, a last faith. They no longer fought for a Reich, nor for a flag. They fought for the chance to reach the next night. The collapse did not happen on a single line. It happened in every soldier, one by one, as Soviet artillery continued advancing toward the capital. The Soviet bombing in the Battle of the CEO Hills. The night of April 15, 1945 fell over the Oder River like an ancient omen. The sky was covered with low clouds and the humidity formed a dense mist that clung to the ground. Along the riverbank, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers awaited the order to advance. No voices were heard. There were no fires. Only a mechanical expectant silence. The artillerymen kept their hands on the levers. The Kushia operators started their engines at low speed. The Red Army had transformed into a living organism, ready to unleash a cataclysm. At 3:30 a.m. on April 16, the horizon suddenly lit up. Thousands of searchlights pointed from the Soviet rear toward the German positions, illuminating the fog from below and creating an unreal spectral glow. At the same time, 40,000 artillery pieces opened fire in a single salvo. The roar was so powerful that in Berlin, 70 kilometers away, the windows vibrated. The CEO Hills, the last natural stronghold before the capital, turned into a hell of continuous explosions. The earth opened up. The trenches disappeared. The German defenses were literally lifted into the air. General Zhukov, observing from an elevated post, expected the entire German front to collapse within hours. Stalin had demanded immediate results. Every minute counted. Zhukov knew that Marshal Konev was advancing from the south with the same ambition. This offensive was not just a military operation. It was a race for the glory of taking Berlin. Every explosion in Kahler was also a beat of the Marshal's political heart. But Colonel General Henri Chi had anticipated the movement. He had ordered the withdrawal of the first German lines just before the bombardment. The trenches were empty. When the first Soviet soldiers advanced among the smoking craters, they were met with machine gun fire from hidden positions further back. The attack designed to completely destroy the German defensive line now collided with a scattered but methodical resistance. Soviet casualties began to mount. Zhukov ordered intensified fire. For 3 days, the artillery did not cease. Kushias launched rockets in waves. The sky burned with trails falling like fiery comets. The T-34 tanks advanced through the mud under direct fire, trying to pave the way for the infantry, but the terrain, deliberately flooded by the Germans, turned into a deadly swamp. Many tanks became immobile, submerged up to their turrets. Their crews died inside when enemy shells hit the fuel tanks. The German soldiers fought as if every hill were their inevitable grave. Folk units composed of elderly men and teenagers clung to their positions. firing panzerasts at point-blank range. The remaining panzer divisions constantly moved to avoid enemy fire. But whenever one of their tanks was destroyed, the rest began to retreat without orders. The Luftwaffe appeared only rarely, unable to change the course of the battle. On April 17, Zhukov received a direct message from the Kremlin. Comrade Stalin asks the reasons for such a slow advance. Though Marshal, under pressure, ordered frontal attacks without considering losses. Soviet soldiers advanced in waves knowing that many would not return. The order was clear. The motherland is behind us. The enemy is in front of us. No retreat is possible. Political commissars shot any man who hesitated to advance. The CEO. Hills became a continuous field of death. Blood mixed with rain and mud. Thousands of bodies lay abandoned among craters. Trees burned like black torches. A German paratrooper unit was annihilated in a single hour. A Soviet officer wrote in his diary, "The ground trembles as if it wants to escape the horror." Yet the advance continued. Henrichi's lines began to break on the third day. The German soldiers, exhausted without ammunition or reinforcements, could no longer hold back the Soviet waves. Communications were destroyed. The German commanders fled toward Berlin without waiting for instructions. The last line of hills, blackened and covered with corpses, was lost at dawn on April 19. Zhukov did not celebrate. He observed the devastated terrain, aware that he had sacrificed tens of thousands of men to open a gate to Berlin. Stalin did not congratulate him. He only sent a dry phrase by radio: "Proceed to the capital." The hills of Salio had fallen. The road to Berlin was open. The beginning of the Berlin blockade. On April 20, 1945, while Adolf Hitler was celebrating his 56th birthday in the Chancellery bunker, Soviet artillery began firing directly at the center of Berlin. It was neither an air raid nor fighting on the outskirts. These were the first long-range shells hitting the capital of the Reich. The explosions shook the foundations of the government buildings. The glass windows of the Reichstag vibrated with a high-pitched sound as if they were moaning. The war had reached the heart of Germany and there was no escape route left. Marshal Zhukov had managed to break the front at the Silo heights. His T-34 tanks were now advancing along roads covered with refugees, mud, and wreckage of German vehicles. To the south, Marshal KV crossed the Spree, pushing the last Wehrmacht units northwest. Stalin had given both a single order: completely encircle Berlin and seal its fate. Each Soviet army moved with the precision of a pincer closing on the throat of a dying animal. The access routes to the city were lost within hours. The Frankfurt Highway fell on April 21. Potsdam was surrounded on April 22. The roads to the west used by thousands of desperate civilians to flee toward the American lines came under artillery fire. Many refugees, seeing Soviet tanks on the horizon, abandoned their carts and fled into the forests. Others, exhausted, knelt on the roads with their hands over their heads, waiting for a quick death. The columns of military vehicles tried to force their way through, running over anyone in their path. Chaos was no longer the consequence of defeat. It was the very form of resistance. Inside Berlin, the population received the news of the siege with a mix of astonishment and resignation. The Nazi Party authorities ordered that no civilian leave the city. The radio broadcast speeches glorifying the final sacrifice of the German people. Goebbels declared that Berlin would become the invincible fortress of National Socialism, but the Berliners no longer listened to these words. They heard the incessant rumble of Soviet fire as if the earth itself were cracking beneath them. The bunker filled with maps indicating positions that no longer existed. Hitler, pale with a trembling right hand, traced imaginary arrows, ordering counterattacks by divisions that had been destroyed days earlier. He ordered General Venn to launch an attack from the west to liberate Berlin. Wenck barely had incomplete units of Fulton teenagers. Far from following orders, they would try to flee to the Yella. Hitler was creating a parallel reality in which non-existent forces could still change the fate of the Reich. General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the defense of Berlin, inspected the outer perimeter for the last time. He found empty machine gun nests, guns without ammunition, and anti-tank positions manned by 60-year-old men armed with museum rifles. Yet, the Soviets advanced Cautiously, they knew Berlin would be a battle fought house by house, cellar by cellar. Zhukov's orders were clear: completely encircle the city before entering it, cut off all escape routes and let fear do its work. On April 23, the encirclement was officially complete. Berlin was surrounded. No one entered or left. The Red Army controlled every road, every crossing, every bridge. Soviet soldiers raised red flags over the villages of the outer belt. The sound of tank engines mixed with the cries of civilians hiding in basements. Government buildings filled with officials burning documents, throwing files into the flames, destroying evidence of years of crimes and complicities. The smoke from those fires mingled with that of bombed buildings, creating a dark haze that covered the city center like a shroud. In the Chancellery, Hitler received confirmation that Heinrich Himmler had tried to negotiate surrender with the Western Allies. The news struck him as a personal blow. The regime was collapsing, not from enemy force, but from internal betrayal. Hitler shouted that all was lost. Then he composed himself and uttered the phrase that would mark those present: "The war is lost. But if you gentlemen think I will abandon Berlin, you are mistaken. I would rather shoot myself in the head." On the surface, civilians gathered in long lines in front of air raid shelters. Some carried suitcases. Others pushed baby carriages. Many women carried empty bottles, hoping to find water from public fountains still working. Terror was no longer abstract. Shells exploded in central streets, tearing chunks of asphalt and sending shrapnel against walls, windows, human bodies. That night, Berliners witnessed an image they would never forget: the light of fires reflected in the silent waters of the River Spree while Soviet columns entered the city. Berlin ceased to be the capital of the Reich. It had become a trap. Life inside the Führer's bunker. The air inside the Führer bunker was thick with humidity, sweat, and cigarette smoke. The walls oozed condensation. The floor, covered with cheap linoleum, sank slightly under every step. The underground complex, buried 8 m beneath the gardens of the Reich Chancellery, had no windows or natural light. Everything that happened inside was artificial. The light, the time, the Führer's voice. Outside, Berlin was burning. Inside, the world of the Nazi regime continued to function like a theater where the actors already knew the play had ended but had to keep reciting their lines. Adolf Hitler lived isolated in a small underground apartment. He shuffled his feet hunched with his left hand constantly resting on the table. He suffered from uncontrollable tremors. His eyes were sunken and surrounded by purple shadows. Sometimes he spoke in whispers. Other times he shouted orders to imaginary generals. He spent hours in front of a map moving divisions that no longer existed. He demanded counterattacks from the north by General Steiner. Even though Steiner had only a few hundred scattered, unarmed men, reality no longer mattered. For Hitler, continuing to give orders meant continuing to exist. Eva Braun spent most of her time in a room decorated with elegant furniture brought from Obersalzberg. She wore carefully chosen outfits, applied makeup every morning, and drank champagne from crystal glasses as if still at a gala. She laughed forcedly, told irrelevant anecdotes, deliberately ignoring the roar of the bombing. Some days she sat next to Hitler as he read invented war reports. She listened with a beatific expression as if witnessing the glorious end of a tragedy. No one spoke of the fate that bound them. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, had settled in the bunker with his wife Magda and their 6 children. Goebbels spent hours writing speeches that would never be broadcast. Convinced that his duty was to document the National Socialist spirit for future generations, Magda resigned to defeat, cared for the children while murmuring that she would not let them live in a world without National Socialism. In the corridors, the children played with tin soldiers as the foundations shook with every Soviet explosion. Martin Bormann controlled the entrances and filtered who could see the Führer. He moved like a priest of a dying cult, protecting the last mechanisms of power. He ordered the execution of anyone who hinted at surrender. He signed death sentences on scraps of paper, knowing that no one would leave the bunker alive. His face remained impassive, but his eyes showed despair. For Bormann, the fall of Berlin meant the end of his existence, not only physically, but spiritually. In the conference room, officers reviewed false reports to avoid provoking Hitler's outbursts. Every meeting began with the same phrase from the Führer: Steiner will counterattack. No general dared say that Steiner had no forces. When someone hinted at it, Hitler slammed the table and shouted that the German army would rather die than surrender. At one of these meetings, General Wittling reported that the reserves had disappeared and that Berlin would fall within days. Hitler accused him of treason. Only Bormann's testimony prevented his immediate execution. The sound of the bombing was constant, like a deep breath that never stopped. Sometimes the lamps flickered, the ceiling trembled, plaster fragments fell on the desks. In the corridors, the distant roar of collapsing government buildings could be heard. The walls vibrated with each impact. Outside, the sky was an ocean of fire. Inside, the clocks marked the hours as if time continued normally. The Führer's mood oscillated between fury and resignation. At one moment, he ordered the destruction of all German infrastructure so that the enemy would inherit nothing useful. The next day, he blamed the German people for failing to fulfill what he called their historical destiny. He repeated, "If Germany is incapable of winning this war, it deserves to perish. Those who survive will be weak and without a future." No one present responded. They were no longer listening. They were simply waiting. At night, in the officers' quarters, cognac, wine, and confiscated whiskey were poured. The high command drank in silence. Some sobbed in shadowed corners. Others composed letters that would never reach their recipients. The secretaries, utterly exhausted, typed the Reich's final decrees, fully aware that by dawn, all of it would be meaningless. In the bunker, the radio broadcast military marches while Soviet forces closed to within less than 2 kilometers. On April 22, Hitler received the final report. Steiner would not attack. He could not. Hitler sank into a chair, unmoving, remaining that way for several minutes. Then he spoke in a barely audible voice, "Everything is lost." No one replied. In that instant, the bunker ceased to function as the command center of an empire. It became a tomb awaiting its occupant. The civil collapse of the city had begun. The final chapter of Berlin was not written in halls of power, but in basements, subway tunnels, and ruins where hundreds of thousands of civilians were crushed together. A population that had endured years of Allied bombardment now confronted an entirely new reality: the total breakdown of human order. There was no government, no police, no moral or military authority. The entire city had transformed into a battlefield, and its inhabitants were trapped between two unstoppable forces. Sirens were no longer necessary. Soviet artillery fell without pause on every district. Underground shelters overflowed far beyond capacity. People of every age pressed together between cracking walls, breathing air thick with smoke and terror. The stench was overwhelming: layers of sweat, burned fabric, infected wounds, and unburied bodies. Mothers clutched their children, murmuring prayers. Some elderly sat silently, staring into nothingness as if their minds had already departed their bodies. Explosions shook the earth. Dust rained from ceilings as though the world itself were collapsing. Food had disappeared, shops had been empty for weeks, warehouses stripped bare. Bread supplies had dwindled to hardened fragments rationed among families. Children cried from hunger. Some civilians dared to venture outside in search of water, weaving through burning buildings to gather filthy snow or draw liquid from shattered pipes. Public fountains had lost pressure. For thousands, the only remaining source was the Spree River, fouled with ash and human remains. Electricity failed across most districts. Nights were illuminated only by flames, with winds carrying sparks that ignited the last intact roofs. Fires spread without control. The crackle of burning wood blended with the thunder of artillery and the groans of the wounded. Ambulances no longer moved, fuel was gone. Hospitals functioned by candlelight or handheld lamps. Doctors operated on improvised kitchen tables in basements, without anesthesia. The wounded bit down on leather to suppress screams as limbs shattered by shrapnel were amputated. Many bled to death before aid could reach them. Corpses accumulated in corridors and corners, covered with blankets by civilians unable to bury them. The stench permeated everything. Moral collapse mirrored physical ruin. Desperation drove unimaginable acts. Entire families swallowed cyanide together. Mothers killed their children before ending their own lives, believing it spared them what awaited them when the Red Army arrived. Party leaflets called for resistance to the last breath, but no one listened. Survival became the only law. In the eastern districts, the first civilians to encounter Soviet troops were elderly women, kneeling with raised arms. The soldiers did not fire. They advanced, yet behind each column followed rear units and stragglers driven by hunger for revenge. Looting began at dusk on April 23. Shops, homes, and cellars were ransacked. What could not be carried away was smashed. The streets filled with scenes of terror. Women were dragged by their hair into doorways, girls screamed for help that never came, men were beaten, forced to dig graves, or executed without trial. Many civilians, hearing the first shots on their streets, locked themselves in dark rooms with poison or firearms, waiting their turn. Others remained frozen in shelters, paralyzed by fear, listening to boots overhead as if the world were being consumed inch by inch. In some areas, Soviet troops distributed bread in tins of meat, yet panic endured. For Berliners, the war did not arrive as an occupying force, but as historical retribution. Nazi propaganda had warned for years of the enemy from the east. Now that enemy materialized as an unavoidable presence. Each day tightened the noose. Subway stations became underground cities. Thousands slept on platforms covered in filthy blankets, sharing space with wounded horses, dying elderly, and soldiers who refused to return to the front. Immobilized trains in tunnels served as makeshift shelters. Families lit candles and read Bible passages while the ceilings rattled from impacts above. On the surface, the last party officials painted slogans on shattered walls: "Berlin resists. Victory is certain." No one noticed anymore. Only columns of smoke, relentless Soviet detonations, and the dead silence of abandoned neighborhoods remained. The brutality of the Soviet advance was unparalleled. The Red Army did not enter Berlin as a conventional military force, but like a natural catastrophe, carrying the weight of 20 million dead, cities obliterated by the Wehrmacht, burned villages, and executed civilians. Soviet propaganda spoke of liberation, but in Berlin there were no speeches, no flags, no parades, only fire, chaos, and vengeance forged since Stalingrad. The first impact was sound. Automatic gunfire inside buildings, shouts cut short by bursts, boots pounding stairwells, axes splintering doors. Troops hardened by 4 years of total war made no distinction between soldier and civilian. Every structure was a target, every basement a suspected sniper nest. The logic of the Eastern Front dictated that anyone who did not surrender immediately was an enemy to be destroyed. Rapes began the very night Soviet units crossed the Spree River. They were widespread and systematic. Women of all ages were dragged from shelters, assaulted repeatedly, often killed when they resisted. Others took their own lives to protect their children. Mothers offered themselves to save their daughters. Some smeared themselves with blood or filth to appear dead. This was not individual hatred, it was collective vengeance, a suppressed fury justified as punishment. Anthony Beaver recorded testimonies of female doctors treating as many as 70 rape victims in a single night in the Mitte district. Victims ranged from 12 to 70 years old. Sexual violence became a weapon of psychological annihilation, aimed not at pleasure but at total humiliation, striking at the identity of a people long proclaiming racial supremacy. Looting followed a pattern. Soldiers stormed homes, seizing watches, rings, coats, radios, bicycles, and food. In some cases, pianos, mirrors, and paintings were carried away. The Reich, which had plundered Europe, now watched its stolen wealth travel east. Executions were swift. Anyone suspected of resistance, hiding weapons, or merely watching was shot. Elderly men defending their homes were killed. German soldiers who surrendered were machine-gunned, sometimes forced to dig their own graves. The unspoken motto was clear: show no mercy, remember Stalingrad. T-34 tanks shelled entire buildings if snipers were suspected. Not all Soviet soldiers behaved identically. Some officers enforced discipline, protected civilians, shared food, and stopped assaults, but they were few. The dominant impulse was indiscriminate revenge. Stalin's propaganda understood its psychological power. Every captured block delivered a message. The Reich had not merely been defeated, it had been humiliated, crushed, erased. Loudspeakers broadcast in German: surrender. There is no escape. Resistance means death. The words echoed through the ruins like the voice of inevitable destruction. Even fanatical party members fell silent. Terror no longer descended from the sky, but emerged from shadows and the faces of soldiers deciding lives in seconds. Civilians lived each minute as a suspended sentence, without refuge or authority, only the instinct to survive. The Red Army pushed toward the city center, leaving behind a landscape no longer belonging to the living. By April 25, Berlin's sky had become a black vault pierced by smoke, red flames, and intermittent flashes of artillery. The roar never ceased, as if the earth itself groaned. Escape routes vanished, the city was fully encircled. The war devolved into combat for every street, basement, and room. Remaining Wehrmacht divisions barely existed. What remained was a final defensive line composed of men with no military experience, Volkssturm members, elderly men, students, party officials, and Hitler Youth teenagers. Many could scarcely aim, yet clutched Panzerfausts like sacred relics. They took positions in shattered windows and rubble, not fighting for victory, but out of blind obedience to a dying creed. The Soviets advanced with ruthless caution. Each building was treated as a fortress. Flamethrowers, grenades, and heavy machine guns ripped through walls. T-34s collapsed facades onto defenders. Germans fought from tunnels, subway shafts, and sewers, turning the city into a labyrinth of death. Near the Brandenburg Gate, Hitler Youth boys, some barely 14, staged ambushes. One fired a Panzerfaust and destroyed a tank, smiling briefly before shrapnel cut him down. No glory remained, only the tragic sacrifice of children against steel. In the government district, foreign Waffen-SS volunteers, French, Norwegian, Latvian, Croatian, and Flemish, fought to the last round, knowing surrender meant death. A French volunteer fired while reciting a prayer in his native language. When ammunition ran out, defenders turned to bayonets and Molotov cocktails. Death was inevitable. Inside the Reichstag, savage fighting raged. The roof was gone, columns blackened, air thick with smoke, dust, and ash. Soviets hurled grenades through windows, Germans fought hand-to-hand, using corpses as barricades. Shouts in multiple languages echoed through the ruins. At dawn on April 30th, the Red Army raised a red flag over the shattered dome. Gunfire continued inside. Defenders, unaware that Hitler was already dead, fought on in basements among broken columns and burned files. The final perimeter around the Führer's bunker consisted of SS officers, guards, party officials, and scattered remnants from the front. Artillery shook the ground, the chancellery burned, sculptures lay in fragments, ponds filled with debris and bodies. At 3:30 p.m., a gunshot echoed inside the bunker. Fighting outside continued. Berlin, reduced to fire and dust, resisted through inertia rather than hope. Every shot echoed an empire that no longer existed, a final note of a symphony destroyed at its climax. The Soviets advanced methodically, encountering no surrender, only ruins, corpses, and silent resistance. In the final hours, the Reich had no government, no leader, no army, only men firing their last bullets, and a city dying beside them.